Cape Lookout is a place that doesn't change quickly. The sea carves the shoreline inch by inch, the wind howls the same tune it has for centuries, and the old lighthouse stands tall, weather-beaten, isolated, and eternally watching. It rises above the dunes like a silent sentinel, its black and white diamond pattern as familiar as the sun or stars to those who've lived nearby. Most visitors see it only by day, posing for photos or walking the beach. But the lighthouse is different at night. It breathes. My name is Thomas Albridge, and for over a decade, I worked for the National Park Service, stationed at Cape Lookout. I lived alone on the barrier island in a small maintenance cabin a few hundred yards from the lighthouse. My job was to inspect, preserve, and report. But I also learned to listen to the wind, the tides, and eventually, something else. It was the winter of 1983 when I first heard it. I remember the date, October 24th, not because of anything particularly special, but because of what followed. That evening, I was sitting in my cabin, sipping lukewarm coffee and writing up a maintenance report. The wind had picked up around dusk, the kind of gusts that creak the wooden siding and rattle loose panes of glass. Normal for Cape Lookout, but somewhere around midnight, the wind paused. Completely. The air hung still, unnaturally so. Even the ocean seemed to stop breathing. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely louder than a whisper, weaving through the silence. At first, I thought it was the wind returning, a high-pitched moan maybe, slicing through the dunes. But it wasn't the wind. It was crying. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The moon was nearly full, casting silver-blue light across the dunes. Everything looked the same, but the sound, it grew clearer. A woman's voice, soft, steady, almost like a child sobbing into a pillow. It was coming from the lighthouse. I stood still for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the sound faded. I returned inside, locked the door, something I rarely did, and barely slept. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had been the wind, or a dream, but part of me knew better. Over the following months and years, I heard the crying again. Not every night, not even every month, but always on October 24th, just after midnight. Cape Lookout had always been a place of mystery. Sailors called it the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. The shifting shoals off the coast had claimed hundreds of ships since the 1700s. The lighthouse was built in 1859 to prevent such tragedies, but even it couldn't stop nature's wrath. Stories, of course, followed. Fishermen talked of ghost ships. Locals swore they'd seen lights in the tower long after it was decommissioned. But most people brushed it off as folklore. I didn't. About 5 years into my post, I started digging through old records stored in the maintenance shed. Dusty boxes filled with logs, maps, handwritten letters. That's when I found it. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and cracked at the edges, dated 1907. The name inside, Elias Whitmore, lighthouse keeper. The entries began plainly enough. Weather notes, maintenance records, routine observations. But then, in October of that year, the tone shifted. On the 25th, Elias wrote, "She's gone. The storm took her. I waited all night, lantern lit, but she never came home. They say the sea claimed her. But I don't believe it. I hear her still, weeping, always weeping." My chest tightened. I flipped through the next few entries. All of them mentioned the same thing, midnight tears. A voice that cried from the top of the tower. One passage chilled me to the bone. It happens only once a year. The sea goes still. The wind pauses. Then the crying begins. I light the lamp, but there's no one there. I call her name, but she won't answer. He never wrote her name, only called her she. And then the journal ended abruptly. No explanation. No final entry. Just silence. I held the journal in my hands for a long time that night. The same night, October 24th. I didn't sleep. Over the years, I began to mark the date in my calendar. I treated it like a storm warning, not because I feared the crying, but because I felt compelled to witness it, to listen. Each year, I sat alone on the beach or at the base of the tower, just after midnight, and waited. The sound was never exactly the same. Sometimes it was distant, like a whale carried on the tide. Other times it was close, too close, as if someone were standing beside me. But it was always sorrowful, raw, and unmistakably human. I never told anyone, not my coworkers, not my family. I kept the journal hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin. Until now. I left the Cape in 1995. Time passed. The world changed. But every October, like a clock wound tight, I'd remember. And I'd wonder if the crying still echoed from the lighthouse. Or if perhaps someone else had heard it too. Next week, I'm returning to Cape Lookout for the first time in 30 years. October 24th. One last time. Because I need to know if she's still waiting. The fall of 1907 came with no warning. Cape Lookout skies, usually crisp and clear in October, began to darken early that year. According to the old Lighthouse journal I found, the days had turned gray by mid-month, the winds restless, the ocean uneasy, as if something deep beneath the waves had begun to stir. Elias Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper at the time, was a widower in his early 40s. His hands were thick with calluses, his boots salt-worn, and his hair perpetually wind-tossed. But his face, according to faded records and a single surviving photograph, carried a quiet sadness. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, had moved with him to the island shortly after their marriage in 1898. No children, just the two of them and the sea. Margaret was remembered fondly by the few who lived on nearby Harke's Island, a gentle woman who wrote poetry in the margins of recipe books and collected shells in jars. She'd occasionally row a small boat to the mainland to post letters, or sometimes, just to watch the gulls follow the fishing boats. On October 22, 1907, Margaret took her skiff out at sunrise. According to Elias's entry that day, she kissed my cheek and promised to return before nightfall, said she wanted to bring back sugar and tobacco before the next rain. I watched her row until the fog swallowed her. But the storm came sooner than expected. It was violent, what we would now call a nor'easter, though records suggest it may have been stronger. By noon, the seas were rising, frothing against the shoals with such fury that ships along the outer banks dropped anchor and prayed for their hulls to hold. Rain whipped sideways, soaking through every crack. The lighthouse stood firm, but inside, Elias lit the beacon at midday, long before sunset. He waited, watched, scanned the horizon for a single small boat. But Margaret never came back. For 2 full days, Elias refused to leave the tower. The entries in his journal became shorter, frantic. No word, no sight of her boat. Shoreline searched. Only driftwood and kelp. Then, something isn't right. The sea doesn't feel empty. It feels watchful. By October 24th, the skies had cleared, but Elias wrote of a strange stillness. No gulls, no breeze, just an unnatural hush that blanketed the island like a fog of grief. And that night the crying began. He described it in detail. A woman sobbing, low and hollow, coming from the top of the lighthouse, even though no one was there. He searched every stairwell, every iron platform, lantern room, and window. Empty. Yet the weeping continued. It lasted almost exactly 1 hour. Then silence. The next night, nothing. The next year, the same date, the same hour, the crying returned. Elias began to believe that Margaret had not drowned. Not entirely. In one of his final journal entries, dated October 25, 1910, he wrote, "It is her. I feel it. The grief is hers, but it clings to the tower now. She is lost not in the sea, but between places. I keep the light burning, but it offers no comfort." That entry chilled me. The phrase "between places," as if she hadn't passed on, but was suspended, caught between life and death, waiting in the tower like a soul that refused to fade. What haunts me more than the entries, however, is what happened after. In 1911, Elias vanished. His final log entry was dated October 24th. Simply read, "Tonight, I will climb the tower. I will listen. And if she cries again, I will answer." He was never seen again. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage to the cabin or tower. His boots were left at the base of the stairs. The beacon had not been lit that night, something that had never happened under his watch. The Coast Guard launched a brief search but chalked it up to drowning, assuming perhaps Elias had thrown himself into the sea. But those of us who've spent time at Cape Lookout, we know better. Because even after Elias was gone, the crying continued. Every October 24th, just after midnight, it begins again. When I first heard it myself in 1983, I didn't know any of this history. The journal hadn't yet surfaced. The archives had been untouched for decades. But when I eventually pieced the dates together, when I aligned the storm records, the log entries, and the whispered stories told by the island's oldest residents, it became too much to ignore. Something happened that night in 1907. Something unnatural. And it left an imprint, not just on the keeper, but on the land, the sea, and the air itself. Cape Lookout had always been a place of shipwrecks and sorrow, but the weeping woman, she was something else. She was still there. Some nights, I would sit beneath the tower and swear I felt a presence at the top, watching. Once, I even climbed the spiral stairs just after midnight, flashlight in hand, boots echoing on the iron steps. The crying was louder up there, almost unbearable. But the lantern room was empty, and yet, the scent of sea salt and lavender, the same scent Margaret reportedly wore, lingered in the air. I never told anyone in official reports, not because I was afraid of being dismissed, but because I wasn't ready to share it. Some stories, once spoken aloud, take on a life of their own. But as I prepare to return to Cape Lookout this year, the same date, the same time, I can't help but wonder, what if Elias had been right? What if she truly is trapped between worlds, still crying, still waiting? And what happens if someone answers? I hadn't stepped foot on Cape Lookout in nearly 20 years, but something about this October felt heavier than usual, like an unfinished conversation waiting for a reply. The ocean air carried a strange weight, and the sky, even before twilight, was already bruised with darkening clouds. I arrived just after sunset. The boat ride had been unusually quiet. No gulls, no wind, just the hum of the engine and the steady pulse of memory. The lighthouse stood tall in the distance, just as I remembered, its silhouette cutting into the sky like the spine of an old ghost. The keeper's quarters had long since been abandoned, but I had permission to stay the night. The Park Service still allowed researchers, historians, and the occasional folklorist like myself to observe, so long as we signed waivers and promised not to disturb the structure. I made my bedroll near the base of the tower and sat on the steps, watching the last light bleed out of the horizon. The moon hung low and yellow, distorted by the mist creeping in from the sea. I checked my watch. 11:42 p.m. 18 minutes. That's how long I had until the crying usually began. I pulled out Elias Whitmore's journal, now brittle, its edges browned with time. I read the last entry again, fingers brushing over the final sentence. "If she cries again, I will answer." I whispered it aloud, testing the words in my mouth. They felt both foreign and familiar, like something I'd said in a dream and forgotten upon waking. At 11:58 p.m., I rose. The iron door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the spiral staircase winding upward into blackness. I climbed slowly, my flashlight casting long, skeletal shadows on the walls. Each step echoed like a breath held too long. At 12:01 a.m. it began. The crying. It didn't explode into the silence. It seeped into it, like water soaking through wood. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the moan of the wind, but then clearer. A woman's sobs, wavering, grief-stricken. It came from above, from the lantern room at the top of the tower. I paused midway up the stairs, heart hammering. This wasn't the distant weeping I'd heard years ago. This was closer, sharper, as though someone was just around the bend. I continued climbing, each step slower than the last. The crying grew louder, not angry, not violent, just broken. When I reached the final platform and stepped into the lantern room, I half expected to find it empty, just the way it always had been. But this time there was someone there. She stood facing the glass, back to me. Her hair was dark, soaked and clinging to her back as though she had just emerged from the sea. She wore a dress, white, but stained near the hem, as though touched by salt and sand. The sobbing came from her, but she made no motion. She simply stared out toward the black ocean, shoulders trembling with every breath. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The journal fell from my hand and hit the metal grate with a dull thud. She turned, slowly. Her face was pale, eyes impossibly wide, and though her features shimmered as though not fully solid, there was no mistaking the expression. Recognition. She knew me, not as myself but as someone else. And then she whispered, barely audible above the waves, "Elias." My blood ran cold. I wasn't Elias. But in that moment, I could see what she saw. I felt his sorrow, his years of waiting, his longing etched into every stone of this tower. And now I understood. She hadn't been weeping for herself. She had been weeping for him. For the man who kept the light burning every night, even as his own hope flickered. "I'm not him," I said, voice shaking. "But I'm here." She stared at me, and for a moment the crying stopped. The silence was thick, pulsing with something unspoken. Then she stepped forward, not walking, but gliding, and reached out her hand. Her fingers hovered inches from mine. Cold air swirled around us, and the glass lantern room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of waves and sorrow. And then, just like that, she vanished. No sound, no scream, just gone. The crying didn't return that night, nor did it the next, or the next October after that. It's been 5 years since then. I've spoken of this only once, to a colleague who studies spectral memory and environmental hauntings. He didn't laugh, but he didn't believe either. That's all right. Some stories aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be passed on. Each October, I return to Cape Lookout. I climb the stairs. I sit in the lantern room with the journal in my lap, and I wait. Not for the crying, but for the silence. The calm that only comes after grief has been witnessed and answered. I don't know where she went or if she finally moved on. I only know this. For a moment, in that tower above the sea, someone finally heard her. And that may have been enough. The following autumn, I didn't plan to return. The previous year had closed the chapter, at least that's what I told myself. The crying had stopped. The journal remained undisturbed in its leather case. And the spirit, if that's what she was, had disappeared like sea fog before morning. But Cape Lookout has a strange way of pulling people back. Started with a phone call. A marine biologist named Claire Harwood had been conducting tide pool research on the nearby shore and stumbled upon something buried beneath a cluster of wet stones. A small, rusted tin box. Inside was a bundle of folded letters sealed in wax, the paper eaten by age, but the words surprisingly legible. Each one was addressed to the same name, Elias Whitmore. I met Claire 2 weeks later in Beaufort, where she laid the box on the table between us like it was a sacred artifact. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "You know anything about a man named Elias?" she asked. I did, but I waited, curious what the ocean had whispered to her. She pulled out one of the letters, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was neat, curved in the style of the late 1800s, and the ink, though faded, still held its urgency. "My dearest Elias, the sea has taken everything but your voice. I hear it in the waves still. Come for me. Find me. Bring the light. See." Claire looked up. It's signed only with a C. But that name, that letter, it's repeated over and over. I felt the chill before the wind even touched the windows. Charlotte. The name had never been recorded in Elias' journal. But I knew now. This was her voice. These were her calls. The crying wasn't a haunting. It was a plea. That night, I returned to the Cape. The lighthouse looked different this time. Not physically, but in presence. It no longer loomed. It watched, like it had been waiting for something or someone to come back. I climbed the tower again, slowly, as I had done so many times before. The air inside was musty, but still, and the rust on the iron railing flaked like brittle memories falling apart. I sat in the lantern room for hours. No crying, no presence, just the sound of the ocean moving, alive and restless. Until midnight. That's when the lantern flared. There was no electricity running through it, no generator to power its glow. But for a moment, a breath, it lit up. Just once. A pulse. A flicker. Like the heartbeat of something ancient and lonely. And then it was gone. I descended the tower, shaken. Back at the shore, I walked with a flashlight, retracing the route where Claire had found the box. And that's when I saw it. A woman's footprint. Just one. Embedded in wet sand, far from any trail, facing the ocean. It hadn't rained in days, and no one else had come to this side of the beach. I checked for more, but there was only one, as though she had stepped out of the sea and vanished. Or returned. I followed the tide line north, and after about 20 minutes, something else caught my eye. A single white ribbon caught on a branch of driftwood. Torn. Salt-stained. Old. It was the same type of ribbon used in mourning attire in the late 1800s. That night, I sat by the dunes and read every letter in the tin box aloud, one by one, letting the wind carry the words across the water. I wasn't sure if she'd hear me. I only knew I had to try. And maybe the lighthouse was never cursed. Maybe it was simply a place of waiting, of yearning, a place where light called to the lost, and the lost cried back. Elias had tried to reach her. She had tried to reach him. But it took over a century for someone to bring their voices together again. And what if she hadn't disappeared at all? What if the silence last year wasn't the end, but the beginning of her return? That's the part that keeps me awake now. Because when I close my eyes, I hear it. Not the crying. Something deeper. A hum. Like a voice traveling underwater. Rising through the current. Waiting to be answered. I never planned to stay. After reading the last of Charlotte's letters, I packed up my belongings and returned to the mainland. I told myself I had done enough. Spoken the names, opened the past, let the wind carry their grief back to the sea. But the truth? The lighthouse never left me. In dreams I heard it. Not the crying anymore, but something else. A rhythmic pulsing, like waves rolling beneath my skin. A silent call I couldn't ignore. It wasn't over. A month later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a black and white photograph. It was old, creased at the corners, likely taken in the early 1900s. It showed the lighthouse before the war, tall and pristine, the dunes around it untouched by modern hands. But it wasn't the lighthouse that caught my eye. It was the figure standing in front of it. A woman, barely visible, her face blurred, as if time itself refused to remember her. But in her hand was something unmistakable. A ribbon, salt-stained and white, just like the one I had found on the driftwood. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, was a single sentence. Bring the light back before the sea takes it for good. I don't know who sent it. Claire denied it. So did the Historical Society. But the message was clear. I returned. By the time I reached Cape Lookout, the weather had turned. The wind was heavier, the sky swollen with bruised clouds. The sea hissed at the shoreline, impatient. I made my way to the lighthouse one final time. Inside, the air felt different. Not cold, warm, almost as if someone had just passed through. The spiral staircase groaned under my boots, the wind slipping through the cracks like whispers. At the top, I paused. The lantern room was empty, but the glass panes vibrated, gently, rhythmically, like the beat of a distant drum. I stood there, unsure what I was supposed to do. Then, I heard her, not crying, singing, soft, melancholy, a lullaby carried on sea air, the kind a mother might hum beside a cradle, or a lover might sing across a storm. I turned slowly, and for the briefest moment, I saw her, not in flesh, in reflection, In the warped glass of the lantern room window stood a woman in mourning garb. Face pale, hair tucked beneath a sailor's bonnet. She stared out toward the sea, not at me, her eyes searching the horizon. Then she was gone. But something remained. The lantern flickered, not in light but in memory, like the building itself had remembered its purpose, and was asking me to do the same. So I did the only thing I could. I lit the beacon. I don't know why. There was no ship on the horizon, no sailor in distress. But the moment the light spun its first circle across the sea, the entire tower seemed to exhale. And from the dunes below, I saw something rise from the water. It wasn't a ship. It was light, a faint, submerged glow, like a mirror lantern deep beneath the surface. Pulsed once, then again, responding, calling back. I watched in stunned silence as the light blinked 3 times, slow and deliberate, then faded, gone. But not extinguished, just returned. After that night, the dreams stopped. So did the singing. The lighthouse stood silent once more, but not empty. There was peace now, a calm that hadn't existed before. I reported the strange sight to the local maritime service. They found nothing. No wreckage. No underwater lights. Nothing on sonar. Just open water. And yet I know what I saw. Charlotte's light had been waiting for Elias. For someone. Anyone. To answer her. She was never a ghost in the traditional sense. She was memory. Emotion. A voice that had waited far too long to be heard. I left Cape Lookout a week later. But before I did, I placed the ribbon inside the old journal and sealed them both in a weatherproof case. I left them beneath the steps of the tower, not as a warning, but as a promise. That someone once waited here, and someone finally listened. Now, when tourists come and stand on those shifting dunes, some swear they hear a melody on the wind. Others feel a strange warmth inside the tower, even on the coldest nights. A few claim the glass sometimes fogs from the inside, as if someone is still watching the sea. But no one cries anymore. Not at midnight. Not ever again. And maybe that's the greatest ghost story of all. Not one of terror, but of a love that refused to be forgotten.